Okay, we'll have 1 more minute. If you have not grabbed your tea, coffee post the lunch, which was delicious, in case you want to get that, we do want you to be, here, present, asking questions, because we do have two wonderful speakers with us today. Sumit and Nishith. Sumit joins us from the coaching world. He's experienced he's a PCC certified coach, and Nishith is from SHRM. I think you can see his, who the speakers are from the session. Yeah, as conflicted I am to start with the conversation, I also feel like I would keep nudging all of you to just settle down. Yes? Are we there? Yes? So to grab your attention, let me then kick off with a question. How many of you lead teams within your own organization or within the organization that you work for? Raise of hands, quick show of hands. Okay, that's more than 50% of the room. So, which brings us to our topic today, team coaching. And the specific discussion we'll have today is the relevance of team coaching in times of individual recognition and across diverse cultures. So I'm sure all of you who raised your hands for leading teams know what those challenges look like for team coaching today. And our speakers today, Sumit and Nishith, will be sharing their insights and experience with us. Now, before I hand over the mic or introduce our themes that we want to talk about, quick introduction of our speakers. Sumit Tandon is an ICF PCC credentialed executive coach. He's been a coach since May 2020 with Ernst & Young Global Delivery Services. He specializes in career transformation and leadership coaching and is a certified highest performing team program consultant for executive teams. He has coached more than 350 senior and middle rank professionals across multiple countries, teaming consultant to leadership with focus on team-based coaching, driving winning behaviors for trust, healthy conflict, commitment, accountability, and growth. Welcome, Sumit. We're really happy to have you here. And our next speaker, Nishith, serves as Executive Director of Advisory for India and APAC and MENA at SHRM. He is leading a growing advisory practice focused on enabling clients to realize business goals through better alignment of people practices. With over 19 years of professional experience, he specializes in org design, talent management, and HR consulting. Nishith has worked with leading organizations including Bharti Airtel, PwC, Aon Hewitt, and Accenture. He holds a master's degree in HR and org development from Delhi School of Economics and is an SHRM SCP certified. So welcome again, Nishith and Sumit. As promised, this is going to be a super exciting, interesting conversation, and I don't expect you to have a lot of post-lunch trauma at the moment. And I will start the conversation, by the way, with kicking off something that is, I think, a real challenge most coaches experience, or even as organization leaders experience in team coaching, which is fragmented leadership. There's a lot of different teams, cultures that leaders today are expected to lead in a fast-growing, fast-changing world order, which brings us to the first theme for today. Any one of you who wants to go first, Nishith or Sumit, what are your thoughts on this fragmented form of leadership in the hyper-complex world that we see today?
Okay. Hi everyone. Sorry, I'm being too loud, but just to set context, I've been very fortunate in EY for not only being a one-on-one coach, but taking on team coaching assignments. It's not very common for coaches to have a lens of both sides of coaching, and you're not only working with an individual, but you're also working with teams. So for us, executive coaching for teams has been around for a while now, and it's based on a framework which we use from Patrick Lencioni, which is 5 dysfunctions of a team. So those 5 areas that we cover form the foundation of when we do executive coaching. And when we talk about fragmented leadership, I think one thing which is very common is most leaders would be focusing on their own teams. And that's where the disconnect between focusing on your team, focusing on silos of what KRAs, KPIs matter for your team, and they tend to lose sight of the fact that you're also responsible for the executive layer or the entire enterprise that you're supporting. So when we have done surveys to start these interventions, one thing comes out very clearly is there is invisible fragmentation which does not come on the surface. It gets discovered when they score on some of these parameters, especially on trust and conflict. And we've seen these team leaders, when they come together in executive coaching setup, they typically have things where they don't talk to each other. There would be this artificial harmony where everybody would be nice to each other during these meetings, but they are not going to bring out the real surface problems which probably lie underneath. So that's where we have seen a lot of these interventions require having open dialogue. And I think that's what, when we look at ICF coaching, trust is a very big factor. So when I've been doing these workshops at an executive teaming coaching sessions, the first thing we do is we get everybody in the same room. There are no slidewares, there are no presentations that are there. It is just getting all of these leaders together to talk openly. And it's not easy. First and foremost, the tone has to be set at the top. So the leader of that executive team is the first one who opens up and has those authentic, vulnerable conversations, because only then the others start showing up. Because unless there is not going to be disagreement brought out openly, then I think this fragmented leadership is going to continue. They're going to keep on focusing on their own KRAs for their teams, for their functions. So that, I think, becomes a very critical part, is to have all of them come together and have very open conversations. It's a journey. It's not going to happen right away. But the seeds are sown when the leader sets the stage, comes up being very vulnerable in front of the entire team and calls out what's working, what's not working. And then slowly, steadily, everybody starts to open up. So I think that's the genesis of how the fragmentation needs to slowly, steadily eliminate. It's a journey. It's not going to happen overnight.
Is this? Okay. Firstly, thank you, ICF, for having us over here. Team coaching is something which is fabulous, right? I mean, one of the things that I keep thinking about is, why is it that most organizations have not instituted it the way, let's say, an EY has, okay? But is that sense true? How many of you actually have team coachings happening in your organization? Not as coaches, but in your organizations, how many of you have actually had team coaching? Can I have a quick show of hands? Smattering, maybe 3 out of this room of about, I'm guessing about 30, 35 people. Fascinating, because, the whole impact of team coaching is so significant as compared to individual coaching, that organizations can really benefit out of it. Okay, I'm not a coach. Okay, I lead a practice which does a lot of capability building. We are starting to do some coaching, thanks to this fabulous person called Payal, who's sitting right here, who runs this organization called You Accelerate. Find out more about it. She has a lot of coaches. So basically what happens is, uncalled for plug out there, but but in this capability building journeys, we do a lot of capability building workshops, leadership development programs, etc. But these days we find a lot of people coming to us and asking about coaching, which I think is a great thing. Of course, as I was mentioning to Sumit, that I'm not sure a lot of people really understand what coaching really is and the amount of time and effort that it takes. Team coaching, perhaps even as the show of hands indicated, is not as common. Okay. Let me also be upfront in terms of saying that while I've led a lot of team effectiveness workshops, a lot of team alignment sort of workshops, never ended up calling it coaching. It's only in the last 2 odd weeks that I realized that I have to come and speak at this forum. That's when I started digging more about it and realized this is actually very, very fascinating and can have a lot of impact. But a couple of examples, right, where this has really been a lived reality. One example is from my own organization. Okay, this whole, and I'm taking this fragmentation of leadership with a slightly different twist to it, where I'm saying that, leadership can't be held at one level in an organization, in times like this, which is so dynamically shifting, changing, right? You will need to be able to distribute that leadership. You will need to be able to pass it down, right? And in some ways, enable people to stand up as leaders. We do this very effectively. SHRM does conferences, events like this, okay? Of course, the difference is in scale. A lot of those conferences are multi-million-dollar conferences, okay? Some of them multiplied 10x, okay? And in events like this, where the customer experience is extremely key to everything, you need leaders to emerge from across the organization, right? So if, let's say, there are 100 SHRM people out there, you would need every one of them to stand up and sort of say that I'm a leader to ensure that that customer experience is delivered to every attendee, and I'm talking about like 6,000, 7,000, at times even 25,000 attendees, right? So that enablement doesn't come overnight. It takes coaching. It takes for the team to get coached significantly over a period of time. And that's something which I've seen happening. So that's one brilliant example. Another example is for a Swedish car manufacturing organization that we did a team intervention for. This was essentially between the sales and the services team. Very classical dilemma, right? I'm sure, so people and teams are at loggerheads. But what the SHRM coach did in that particular intervention was really got them to elevate their thinking and think from a perspective of the end customer, right? And sort of elevate the thinking to say that, hey, great, I mean, I'm sure you need to deliver that experience from a service standpoint or from a sales standpoint, but how do you come together and not sort of fight against each other, but collectively sort of elevate to think from the standpoint of customer? That's another example which kind of landed well. And as Sumit said, one of the biggest enemies is, of course, being nice to each other, right? That's perhaps the biggest enabler of status quo and nothing changing, right? And that's something that an effective team coach comes in and sort of starts addressing, first up. So yeah, completely concur with that, and that's something which definitely needs to get addressed.
Thanks, Nishith and Sumit. I agree. I think starting from the top, Sumit mentioned that encouraging leaders themselves to open up, to be vulnerable, does set the example. Very, very similar to setting culture. If we wanted to have an open dialogue, probably starts from the top. And for Nishith's, examples of similar things working across the board, across organizations, and how it can help break barriers. And while I was listening to both of you, I think I came to, it kind of brought me thinking about, well, I think you've touched upon how do we get started with team coaching. But the more curious questions for a lot of organizations as well as team coaches would be, how do you measure that? So a lot of organizations can truly very, very quickly identify their team heroes and the individual contributors who are successful. But how does an organization think about individual success versus, say, collective intelligence? How would a coach or a team coach work with an organization in that arena?
So I think this is very prevalent. We always celebrate heroes. So it's, and in organizations also, if you look at all the reward and performance management systems, they are supposed to recognize speed of delivery, decision making, and how you're executing. So those KRAs and KPIs are always very individual driven, the leaders themselves. So when you are in a team setting, when these teams come together, it's very common that the emphasis would be on success of your function and not of the entire enterprise. And it's not by a bad intent, it's how the entire ecosystem of how you recognize your people functions. So that's what is the genesis of what we notice, and that's where team coaching again comes in quite extensively. In fact, this is one area where a leader of the entire business would request for a teaming intervention, where they want to emphasize to all their leaders in the room that you're doing a great job when it comes to running your own functions, your departments. However, you're also responsible for the entire team or for the entire enterprise at large. And that's where most of the times the areas where these leaders tend to identify problems would be in commitment and accountability. Their commitment is very high for their own functions, but it may not be very high when it comes to their peers. They might very consciously look out for what needs to be done to fix problems in their departments. However, their peers in their own enterprise might be struggling. But for them, it's not a direct KRA, so they would not look into it. And that's where the problem of commitment comes in. Accountability is the next one, where again you're accountable for your own business. Nobody's going to challenge you if your fellow team members' department hasn't done well. So when an executive team comes together, this is where it becomes very critical to really figure out what will it take for this group of leaders who are part of one team to really move above their own teams but move to their enterprise at large. And sometimes a leader would say things like, what, I have agreed with what I've been told, but I'm not fully bought in. Again, because the boss says so. So this is also another very problem that shows up when you're looking at heroes versus looking out for the the bigger good of the teams. And sometimes the question needs to be shifted. Besides your own KRA, what are you willing to commit for the KRAs for your boss? Because your boss is responsible for all the functions. For them, for him or her is what they look at when they see whether the business at large is doing well or not. So when leaders come together, the question needs to change. The question should not be what is your department doing, what your department is responsible for, but the question probably needs to be shifted to what are you willing to commit for the entire enterprise at large? Are you going to also be responsible for if any of your peer team members are not delivering on their KRAs? And that needs to be brought into their KRAs as well. There should be a function level KRAs, there should be enterprise level KRAs also. So then they feel they are more invested in the game.
If I may, possibly the answer as I have seen it doesn't of course lie in individual brilliance, right? It's not about, or individual problems for that matter. It's not about one problematic individual or a couple of problematic individuals in a team. It's probably about how do collectively does the larger team come together? What are the systems and procedures, in which we have them coming together, discussing issues and building on from there, right? And in my experience, organizations tend not to sort of invest in bringing it all together. While the divisions are are very clearly understood, right? If I look at a typical organization structure, everybody at the top will kind of very clearly divide it into sales, marketing, service, whatever, but do we pay enough attention in terms of how does it all come together, right? And when doing so, do we let the people who make those, decisions on a daily basis realize the systemic inputs, right? I've been a practitioner of this practice which is called large-scale interactive processes, large-scale interactive process, and I've seen multiple, people do that. But in team coaching, it's particularly useful because what I've seen is if you get the whole team into the room and once you make them realize the cross linkages, the answer automatically starts coming, and people's focus on ensuring that not just my team's results but the collective result for the whole team is something which is important, works brilliantly, and the energy tends to last way beyond let's say that initial event or something like that we do an LSIP typically in. And it's a brilliant process for sort of making sure that there is a systemic realization of what the larger goals are and not just the system, which I realize is a part of team coaching, and I've seen a lot of team coaches do that. So if you've not tried something like this before, so one practical tip might be to consider doing something like this in your organizations. And there are a lot of brilliant coaches who do this. So yeah.
Thanks, Nishith. I actually wanted to bring this point home, maybe a little bit more real, practical. So when we talk about, moving from this individual success or individual thinking to system thinking, could you share maybe a real life example or instance that you have witnessed or observed in your own organization or the organizations that you coach, just for us to get a real sense of what that shift looks like?
Sure. Multiple examples. I'll quote that of a software services organizations, interestingly based out of Sri Lanka, that we sort of do work with. One of the issues that was plaguing this organization is that the sales team was kind of course, where the customer is, being based out of Americas and Europe, whereas the delivery team was kind of, based here. Given the scale, when it began with, this organization evolved from being a very small to an almost about $100 million organization by the time that we were doing work with. But from its evolution, the whole culture was such that the salespeople would sort of join in from the likes of an Amazon and multiple other large conglomerates and sort of expect the delivery team to be as automated, as efficient as, what their previous organizations would be. Whereas the delivery team would realize that, that the sales is kind of going ahead and making commitments which they have no ways of being able to sort of, just a simple exercise of bringing them together, getting them to realize, in a guided manner, that what are possibilities, right? What can actually be achieved? What have we done? What do we do well? What has been the history of some of those deliveries? Through a guided team coaching intervention was something which was very successful and led to a longer term alignment that I've seen. So that's one example where I think this came in beautifully, and there are many such.
So I won't share an example because being ethically bound as a coach, so I won't share about specific situations of some of the executive team interventions that I've been part of as a coach. However, I'll bring out the elements of what really makes a shift. And this is where, when you have a room full of, let's say, about 8 to 10 department heads who are reporting to their boss, and we're having these conversations about individual versus systemic thinking, one big shift that happens where trust is the foundation is where the leaders, muster up the courage to, in front of their other peers, call out what their success is doing to their peers who probably aren't doing that well. So just realizing the fact that maybe you are tom-tomming about all the good things your function is doing. However, you have an equal responsibility for being vulnerable enough to tell your peers that, well, I didn't realize that, you probably aren't doing that well. And that's where, the things start to change. And when the shift happens through that journey, the job of the boss starts to reduce. Because it's not only the boss now who's responsible for driving system thinking. All the department heads are now playing an equal role. The escalations reduce. The peer-to-peer accountability increases extensively. And I think that's where we talk about how enterprise level growth starts to show. So when we talk about impact, I think the impact happens once they leave that room and when you start seeing your quarterly results and then you start seeing the departments which were not functioning earlier to the desired level have started doing that. And I think it's because everybody is making each of the other peers or team members accountable and making sure that everybody gets lifted in the process.
Yeah, go ahead, Nishith. Thanks, Sumit. That's a wonderful example, I think, obviously without getting into the details, but how a shift begins and how it shows up.
Yeah, another small example that struck me was, and again for my same team, I have my team here as well, so they'll vouch for some of this. So the divisions that we end up with or creating in organizations. So for example, I lead an advisory business, right? The more I reach out to clients, the more successful I am. But the team of MBAs who are there would typically have a reluctance to say that, hey, am I supposed to be going out there and making a cold? Typical. This happens in a lot of organizations, right? Sales, delivery, just as simple as getting each other to realize what the other person is supposed to do, right? Develops that empathy muscle so strongly, right? That once you have an advisory person realizing what does it take to sell a conference ticket for 25,000. Sorry guys, I'm making it very real. What does it take to sell a conference ticket for 25,000 and do that year on year, right, with the same set of organization, is something which develops that empathy muscle very, very strongly. And that should really be practiced. If those cross linkages are not built in, then of course you are doomed to sort of continue to work in silos, right? But bringing them together, realizing how people work together, building that empathy muscle becomes very important in this context.
Absolutely, makes complete sense. And we have a hand raise. I was going to say I will ask one more question before we go to Q&A, but all of you have been nodding. So I think this is an interesting topic and a lot of questions from the group. So I'm going to make a little bit of an exception and hand over the mic to the group if you want to go ahead and ask a few questions.
Thank you, Sumit and Nishith. Wonderful so far. I thought, audible? Yes. Use the mic. Yes, and use the mic. Hello. Thank you, Nishith. Thank you, Sumit. We've so far talked about team and how you align them with the vision of the organization at large and all. Why I'm talking to you on this is I belong to an organization which also does that, and we do it in a different manner. I'm from the army. I'm Colonel Neeraj. So we have this whole funda about it's called the Naam Namak Nishan. All right. So this is that allegiance to the flag. All of us are Indians here right now, I'm assuming. So we have the allegiance to the flag. Of course, in our journey, we've had bosses of different kind. We've had Sam Manekshaw to other people also. We have very different perspectives to think. So my first question is, when you have people who think very differently, I was in a different, hall altogether, and somebody talked about learning, unlearning, and all of that. Seldom happens in an organization like mine. And I'm assuming now when it happens to other organizations, how do we deal with unlearning? One, that is first question. Given the dynamics of the fluidity of things changing, AI and other things, how do you coach them that unlearning is important to be able to to look at the larger spectrum or the vision of the organization? That's one. The second is you talked about the heroes. The heroes are always celebrated. Again, going back to my organization, we have a teeth to tail ratio. How much will we bite and how much will be the tail, So how much of operations are done and how much of supporting action to it. So it's always, I'm from Special Forces. So it's always the glamorized portion of, the army, we're always there. But I do not want to discount the people who've helped me give me the ammunition, who've given me food when I needed the most, all that. How do you, in your organization that you may have dealt, bring them to not only motivate is a shorter term, but to keep them disciplined to that, for a longer game, so that interoperability of different departments, like you said, there are sales, marketing, all of that. But at the end of the day, tali sales wale ki basti hai. Who's giving you numbers in this? But how do the store manager at the end? How does he, is he in the long game for a longer period, so that his interoperability is at more of function? So these two questions.
Thank you so much for the questions, Colonel, and thank you for what you do for our country. Thank you so much. To your point, I'll take the second question first, which is about the voices. So the heroes always get prime time visibility, and there are others who are working in the behind the scenes. And this shows up in all team dynamics. So when we do these kind of interventions and when we observe teams where different department heads come in, it's very evident there are some who are very vocal in the room and some who would be very quiet. And this is where the leader's job also comes in. How are you sensing the room before you have all your people get everybody's voice heard? So this again is a journey where you have to gauge, and this is where as a coach, my job comes up as a fly on the wall, because I'm just observing what's happening. And that's where the mood shifts. How well are the kind of questions brought into the room changing? Are you making sure everybody gets an airtime in the room for some of these less non-visible departments and their representatives? Are they talking enough? If not, are the others ensuring that they also get a chance to speak? And this is where we say that a true test of inclusion is when the voices which probably are being asked to show up, but that's not a test of inclusion. Are they being celebrated enough to disagree or bring in their perspective, even if it's not a popular opinion? So how are you as a group in that team setting ensuring everybody's voice is heard? Because that's what we say, we have good representation. Representation on paper is happening in all organizations now. We talk about diversity, I think everybody has a diversity agenda. All companies would have diversity in terms of race, gender, ethnicity, everything. So, but it's on paper. How is it that converted into inclusion is the real point here. Are the voices being heard? Are you celebrating disagreements? That's another point. Is diversity or inclusion just showing up on paper, or is it a change of behavior? So those where, some of these things start to show up. So some of these lesser celebrated groups, are they getting chance to speak up? Or are they ones who basically nod along? Because that's where the commitment is going to break. So it's a slow journey that's been experienced in some of the sessions that I have been part of in different executive team interventions. And on the second one about unlearning, I think this is where it's not purely a coaching agenda, it's also a talent development agenda, where while coaching ensures everybody in the room are talking the same language and they're realizing that it's important that with the changing dynamics, with the AIs and the other disruptions that are around, you will need to unlearn and relearn. And everybody knows it. I think it's becoming, but are people actually doing it? I think this is where, again, teaming can be a big thing. When you see your peers, your other team members walking the talk, you tend to follow suit. Some would be quick off the starting blocks, some would be slow to hang on, but it's a wave. Again, that's where a teaming intervention can be a great consideration. And then, of course, you work in tandem with your talent development teams to see how you bring in those aspects of unlearning and relearning.
Yeah, I'll be very quick. I think those two very profound questions at the same go were answered very, very succinctly and correctly by Sumit. The only thing to add is there's this term that I heard leading up to the research that I did here, and I found that very, very powerful. Okay, consistent over the line behavior. Okay, and I'll repeat this again: consistent over the line behavior. See, when the whole system sees that consistent over the line behavior, that is when the message goes out loud and clear that inclusion is the way that we work here, right? Over the line behavior, a lot of leaders demonstrate, right? But is that consistent? In current situations, is that what is seen, right? So for example, if I say that I invite disagreements, right? But the moment a disagreement happens, I come down so heavily on it as a leader that somebody who comes up with it will never sort of ever in their stay in the organization bring it up again. That's being very inconsistent, right? So consistent over the line behavior is what sort of enables inclusion to stay, if that's what your first question, and at least that's how I've interpreted it. Unlearning, of course, that's something which is very difficult to achieve, and in fact it's something that all of us are struggling with. I mean, we were just having a conversation outside. Sir, I believe you run a company which is around AI and coaching, right? So I was just having a funny conversation outside to say that very soon we'll not be looking for coaches, we'll be looking for that type of a bot, right? Possibly coming in. So, but the more serious part here is that all of us will, of course, have to learn and see how to adapt and leverage bots. There are no answers to that to say how can we do that. But yes, being able to send consistent messages across the team that, look, collectively we will have to sort of be a part of learning events or present to each other as a team works, right? Is something that we have seen.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for your wonderful inputs, Sumit and Nishith. One question on behalf of the coaching fraternity. It took many years for individual coaching itself to establish itself, and now people have started to even understand what is coaching and starting to accept that. Team coaching also is one word which has started to come as a buzzword for last few years now. How much is the acceptance and understanding today in the industry for team coaching, acceptance for it? I know organizations like EY and all, they do a great work in team coaching, but generally, how are organizations responding? And for you, Nishith, have you done some research from SHRM standpoint that how's this industry overall developing for the coach community?
Quick responses to that. In fact, it's a very welcome development. Any change is welcome. I think coaching has been accepted by most organizations as being something which is a very important part of the capability building journey. And I see team coaching as the next evolution for coaches to be sort of going ahead and creating much greater impact. Of course, it was being done in very different ways by a lot of consultants, a lot of consulting firms, but now I see team coaching also being done by individual coaching. So it's a fantastic development. Like I said, no, we've not done any research as yet on it, but would love to, because primarily of the impact that one ends up creating in organizations leveraging team coaching. And it can actually be very, very beneficial for a lot of small and medium enterprises, as well as a lot of startups, right? Who are so open to new ways of interacting. I meet a lot of startup founders, and when I ask them to talk about what are the biggest challenges, they come up and say that, the conflicts that I have with my team members, my developers are not just cutting it, right? And I think that's a very behavioral issue, right? Now, if team coaching is coming in and being able to help, that's a brilliant thing. Would love to sort of research more. And probably that's something for Sherm and ICF to collaborate as well at some point in time and do that. Yeah. Great question. Thank you.
Yeah.
I just want to, just one point I want to add on this. Again, I also don't have an external data point or a statistic to say what's the uptake of team coaching. However, I'll share with you the evidence that we are seeing within EY itself. Like you said, team coaching is relatively new, and we also introduced executive level team coaching, or as we call it HPT, which is highest performing teams intervention, about 3 years back. The current data points towards the number of executive level team coaching assignments we are getting is through the roof. And we don't have trained teaming consultants or team coaches to take that on. Definitely. So yeah, no, that's definitely an intervention we have to explore. But the fact is, as more and more teams are getting exposed to it, they are seeing how it's making a tangible change, and then other teams are taking a cue from it to see if they can also get, because there is always something that is not working in a team. So that's just a statistic I want to share.
Today jobs are so complex, and an individual cannot get the job done. It has to be teamwork. So it makes basic sense as a team where we coach like a sports team. But organizations are not doing it, and that's where like Nishith are required.
Yeah, absolutely. And my first reaction to Priyanka when I heard that I'm speaking on this topic, is it effective? Of course it is, right? It's been around for so many years. Right? Look at sports. Look at cricket coaches. Look at IPL. The number of coaches that exist. All of those are team coaches, right? Why not in organizations? Why can't we have a lot of specialized coaches across organizations being able to add value? And please understand, while it's at some point in time, I know Priyanka, you were planning to bring it up later, but some of us see this as a luxury, but IPL doesn't see it as a luxury. Name me one team which doesn't have a team coach. Not a single one. Every one of them would have it. Why can't organizations learn from it? Okay. And I feel some of these evolutions is brilliant, and I feel the time is slowly coming for this. I won't say it's come as yet. It might still take a little bit more time to sort of get used to it, but I hope the pace becomes much faster for sure.
I want to say that I really enjoyed the perspectives that you gave, especially using Lencioni's framework of the 5 dysfunctions. And what you said, the importance of, the priority to the enterprise versus the function, and also the fact that, the capability of peers resolving things amongst themselves instead of going to Papa to solve the problem. So that is the accountability amongst peers that you're talking about. So what I wanted to mention is that there are also other interesting ways of bringing this elephant in the room. And we use spectrograms as well as psychodrama to do this. So one of the ways is where, if you have a group of peers in the room and we ask them spontaneously, if you were to make a family portrait, using that metaphor of the family, who would be the father, who would be the mother, who would be the uncle, aunt in the room. Imagine that a photographer is coming to take the photograph. So immediately there is a spontaneous reconfiguration, and the fact that there is some mummy and some papa and some uncle and some child in the room amongst peers becomes very evocative and very clear, and then they talk about the metaphor. So that becomes a very interesting way of calling out what is actually happening under the surface. And the other way that we also do it is to make a spectrogram of if the goal of the enterprise at the center of the room, and choose an object to put that in the room physically, where would the different functions stand in relation to the goal? So it becomes a spatial map. And then the discussion around that also can become very enlightening. And it bypasses the left brain logical discussion of what is happening.
I feel there are many ways to sort of build that understanding, and there are some brilliant psychometrics, that can be used. And Rashmi is a fantastic coach, and she kind of does this for many organizations, and there's lots to learn from that. But the experience that I've had is just that whole sense of getting the team together, getting the whole system together, and then making them realize that you are empowered, right? And that you can really cut across your existing boundaries. That itself is something which is a very, very powerful mechanism, which sort of unleashes what people across different, silos can end up doing, right? And if that's as simple as something like that being done consistently, right? And then followed through with, and I'll repeat this again, consistent over the line behaviors, right? That's something which will lead to a lot of real-time change.
Thanks, Nishith. Now we are just exchanging mics. Thank you everyone for the questions. I realize that this is one of those topics where there's a lot of interest, not just among coaches, but organizations as an overall understanding what are the benefits, how does coaching really come in, how does it impact our teams, and how does it really give business outcomes to an organization and for an enterprise. So really insightful conversation. I know that a lot of you still have more questions. Unfortunately, this is one of those sessions where we are running out of time now. And I would encourage everybody who has questions, you can definitely meet Sumit and Nishith outside in the lobby area and catch up with him for any specific questions you may have. Before we end this, I definitely want to call upon Vijay Lakshmi and Bharti. We have them in the room to facilitate our speakers, please. Thank you. Yeah, I think if we can have everyone on the stage.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks again. And for the audience, we have a quick 10-minute break and 5-minute break. Unfortunately, it's got cut short. So see you in 5. Quickly grab your tea and coffee and we'll be back in this room. Thank you.